Thank you so much for all having me here today. This has already been just such an interesting event, and I'm really grateful to the opportunity to hear what everybody's got to say. So my name's Lucy Series. I'm currently based in a law school, which is a funny place for me to have ended up because I'm not a lawyer. When I was mostly in my late teens and 20s, I worked in a whole range of health and social care settings, including supported living, care services, services that were supposed to support families and parents with learning disabilities, but which didn't. Intentional communities, and they spanned this whole range from places that really did a pretty good job, not perfect, but a pretty good job of letting people live in their own homes with the support they wanted, how they wanted it, to live the kinds of messy, complicated, ordinary lives that most people just take for granted. Right through to services that were just extraordinarily restrictive, which used very, very high levels of restraint and chemical sedation and so on. And in between that, there were kinds of places that were aspiring to be kind of quite cutesy and cuddly, but which were actually also quite restrictive. So I can remember this intentional community that I will not name on here. And it had this like lovely branding, which is why I'd gone to work for them for free. But when you got there, people were just like not even allowed to choose what they ate for breakfast or how they spent their day. And I actually ended up leaving because there was a kind of revolution from some, I'm going to call them carers, because if I say what their label was, it'd be really obvious what the service was. Some people went on a person-centered planning course and tried to bring the training back into this particular community, and it caused so much upheaval amongst the old guard, the idea that people should be allowed to just have these really basic choices, that they actually they stole our car keys and our credit cards, so we had to leave. So that's where I came from, and when I was on this journey through working through support services, I was like, oh my goodness, this is just not what I was expecting. I thought that when I transitioned from supporting children to supporting adults, that's what I'd be doing, supporting adults, but instead it was more of the same, but even worse. It was almost like you reached 18 and all that happened was the people who had power over you transitioned from your mum and dad to support services, and you weren't being supported to live adult lives. And there was this act that came in at the time called the Mental Capacity Act, which back in the kind of mid to late 2000s seemed like it was just going to change everything, because it said it was going to give people these rights to make these decisions. And my research ever since then has been about trying to understand why that hasn't really worked. And so I have just written a book, which is part one of a two-part story, trying to explain why it hasn't worked. And I suppose there are two factors, and this is what I think is driving what I call the institutional treadmill. So the institutional treadmill is this journey that we've been on since the 1950s of trying to get people out of institutions into homes, and we create these services that we slap a label on called homes, and that began with what Nye Bevan called sunshine hotels, or what we now call care homes, and then it became supported living, and we build these services and we put this label of homes on them, and yet over time, perhaps it doesn't even take very long, they start to look more and more like institutions, and we think, right, we need a different model, and we build a different model, and that the institution just keeps creeping back in, or we keep getting sucked back into our institutional past. And in the book that I've just written, I think there are lots of reasons, there are lots of power sources driving this institutional treadmill. Some of it is around culture and the cultures of staff, and like maybe we can look at training, and Social Care Future are looking at the kind of way, the language we use, cues different ways of supporting people. And culture is really important, but the two issues that I really want to highlight as challenges are about care economics and about mental capacity law. So to take care economics first, part of the issue is that there's a lack of funding, undeniably so. Okay, but there has been times where there has been more funding. There are services that are better funded. I'm thinking ATUs, for example, are very well funded, but they're still massively institutional. And there are all kinds of reasons for this, but some of it is to do with bed-based services are a more reliable income generator in the private sector. And you can read about this if you go and look at care market reports, which are quite hard to get a hold of. They cost thousands of pounds, but you can actually visit them in the British Library. they talk about places where people are sticky, where people can't get out, and places where people have no choice over who supports them as being really the best models to generate profit in this market. So lack of choice is a really integral part of the care industry's profit model. And then even if you gave people these kind of quasi choices, the economics of care requires economies of scale. And you achieve economies of scale by herding people together, which is what we call segregation or congregate living, and then imposing on them a regimented regime which really cuts back on the number of staff you need, the quality of staffing that you need, and the amount of choice that people get over when they're supported, who supports them when and how. So in all kinds of ways, care economics powers this institutional treadmill, and that's very, very hard to unpick, okay? So that shapes the kind of choices that are in theory available to a person, though, where they could live, who could potentially support them and how. But those choices are already really constrained. You know, we're talking not planting a tree in a forest, but in quite a little plant pot. But even within that, the choices that could in theory be available to a person can be really constrained because of mental capacity law. And when the Capacity Act came in the 2000s, I thought it was just going to absolutely blow the roof off things, and it hasn't. And part of the reason it hasn't is because actually the people it puts in the driving seat are still the professionals and the care providers, not the person themselves. They still exercise a huge amount of power to determine whether someone has capacity, to determine their best interests. And it does so in such a way that I think people in this country think that that's the ordinary normal course of things, that of course professionals should be in charge of these things, and of course this is the best way of doing things. It's quite a kind of slick piece of PR, to be honest. But actually, there's this Disability Rights Convention that really tries to blow that way of thinking up, and it tries to put the individual in the driving seat through processes called supported living decision making. We've got a great history of supported decision making in this country, but actually with all kinds of people who are here. But actually, I think a lot of that is a kind of forgotten history, and I don't think the law gives it as much backing as it could. So the possibilities, I think, are firstly, we need to look at supported decision making, look at how we can give that better recognition, better legal backing. The other set of possibilities, I mean, it's short of revolution. I'm not sure what we can do to blow up care economics. I'm not enough of a Marxist to have an answer to this. But what I would say is we need to be really, really cautious about the way that profit sucks away choices through driving economies of scale and congregate living. And I think Social Care Future are offering new ways to think about care that could potentially build the political capital we need to make the really massive changes that are needed at governmental level. That's all I've got to say for now.
Thank you for that, Lucy. Can I invite Sian Lockwood to answer the two questions? Sian, do you need me to say the two questions again, or
no? I've thought about them, and thank you very much, Clinton. And it's lovely to see you, and I like your orange too. I'm for those of you who don't know me, I am retired just in July from my role as CEO with Community Catalysts. Angela and I share a very, very long career together, don't we, Angela? I've got about 30 years of experience in working in different ways with people in local communities to help them set up enterprises that make money, that help other people in their communities. These are all really small. I started with a model called Shared Lives, where families were recruited to offer a home and to share a life with people who need a bit of support and wanted that kind of support. And then moved on to found Comcat's Community Catalysts in 2009, just about, with Angela as a co-founder. I suppose the point of that is we started, this all started with a project from the Department of Health to find ways to support really small enterprises that are offering choice for people. those enterprises were all closing, having to merge, had been taken over by bigger organizations at the time. And many of those early enterprises that we worked with were actually really tiny care homes. And quite a lot of our work, this was in Kent, which is one of the pilot areas, was helping the local authority understand the value of these really, really tiny care homes, because as Lucy says, there was a huge drive towards reducing the number of transactions that local authorities had and forcing merger. There was also a real dislike of the care home model. And I think our view of the very tiny care homes was they were able, not universally, but they were able to offer real choice and flexibility for some people. So that's my kind of work background. I've also got a personal recent background, which is kind of driving my retirement, in that my mum came to live with me at the end of 2019. She was living in her own home until then. She had developed dementia, and it was becoming increasingly hard for her to stay at home, supported by the sort of domiciliary care, which is 4 visits a day, and I was supporting her at a distance, and I couldn't find any of the wonderful micro enterprises that can be really helpful in that situation, as Jane showed. So Mum came to live with me, and I was able, just because this was now my patch, to find some great people to come and help. And she stayed with me until a few months before she died. The reason she moved away is just we couldn't keep her safe. And eventually I found a care home which was run by a charity, but not one of the big for-profits, that was 2 minutes away from me, and they were wonderful, and she really liked it. And then COVID came. And there was a complete lockdown, and for 3 months I couldn't see or talk to my mum, and she deteriorated during that time. She couldn't really use, she found the phone difficult, she found FaceTime even more confusing. And so when we did finally connect again, and the care home were really good in trying to help us stay connected, she had become very much deeper into her dementia journey. But the care home did all they could to keep family contact going, to let me visit when it was safe to do that. And Mum died there, and it was actually a good death. She was surrounded by love from the people in the care home, and we were able to be with her towards that end. So that's kind of influencing my some of my thinking. So just to move on to the main challenges, well, clearly I think people want different things, particularly as they come towards the end of their life. And I think we just need to recognize that people are not uniform, and there needs to be much more diversity on offer. If people can't or don't want to stay in their own home, staying in your own home can be a lonely business for some people. Regulation can make it incredibly difficult to offer diversity, particularly for organisations and people offering accommodation with support. Shared Lives has its own regulatory regime, which we fought for when I was the CEO of Shared Lives Plus before Alex Fox. And that regulatory regime allows the Shared Lives families to be families. But a lot of the smaller care homes don't have that luxury, and they don't have that tailored regulation. So regulation is a big problem, and it often inadvertently regulates against diversity. Local authority commissioning, as Lucy says, there was a huge trend towards merger, towards reducing transaction costs in local authorities and to drive down costs. And we lost a lot of diverse services at that point. And many local authorities still have that mindset. There's also, I think, as well as commissioning barriers in local authorities, there is a cultural barrier against diversity among not necessarily the senior managers, but the people who advise people and control the individual purse strings. So if you take shared lives, which is an established model, is everywhere, it is still a very small option. And some of the reasons it's a very small option is that the people advising find the model uncomfortable. And there's a real fear among frontline commissioners in particular, I think, of blame, because if they advise people who are wanting something a little bit more different, and there's a fear of, that goes wrong, and they will be blamed. So I think those are the challenges, the main challenges I see in terms of opportunities to make a difference. I think, commissioners clearly potentially have a big role in encouraging diversity and in spending money differently and supporting community options such as community microenterprise, to enable people to have real choice of lots and lots of different ways in which they can be supported. And in order for that, commissioners need to really get a sense of the diversity of the people they're supporting, because there is a bit of a one-size-fits-all in the minds of some commissioners, and I think a prejudice against some kinds of living. So I think, so for example, retirement communities tend to be the prerogative of people who are self-funding, because it's really difficult to get public money to support that kind of living, and yet that is a way of living that some people choose and enjoy. So there's a big push. It came up in the chat as well, a big push to that Social Care Futures needs to make around changing commissioning mindset, commissioning culture, as well as perhaps working with Care Quality Commission and other regulators to influence the way in which they think about regulation. And that's a big ask. I've tried, we've worked with CQC ourselves for many years, haven't we, Angela? And that isn't easy to change mindsets. I think there might be a quick win, which is around also a challenge to providers. And I know we've got some great provider representatives in the room here today, but providers to consider working with smaller community-led services and supports to help them change their culture and the experience of the people that they're supporting. And I'm thinking in particular of something quite a long time ago with a time bank in Bromley, where a local small care home had joined the time bank, and that completely transformed the experience of the people living there, because they were being asked to give as well as receiving. And that was a really interesting way of changing the experience of people living in more traditional provision. And so I'm going to stop now, I think. But I'm really interested in the conversation.
Thank you, Sian, for that. Could I invite Ewan King now?
Thank you. Thank you, Clinton. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm in giving my reflections, which I'll do briefly. I'm going to draw upon some work that I've been involved in, Sky's been involved in over the last year, which is the Commission on the Future Role of Housing with Care and Support. And it was a big piece of work. We involved over 1,500 people. We had a co-production panel involved as well, and we spoke to a very wide range of experts across the sector. And the purpose of this commission was to look at the future of housing with care and support, and really develop a bit of a plan for influencing government, but also influencing how things operate at the local level. And it looked at all forms of housing with care and support, so care homes, supported living, extra care, as it's sometimes called, shared lives, home share. So it looked at the whole host of different models. So the key challenges that we came across, I mean, firstly, people told us in the survey that they didn't know much about what was available. That was the first thing that we came across. Lack of information, lack of knowledge about what was available, how to access different types of accommodation was a real problem. People had fears about safety in relation to particularly care homes, but also other settings. And although people put independence as the number one thing that they wanted, they were really concerned that many of the options available didn't really afford them independence and didn't keep them in their local communities close to the people that they love and the people that they know. So there was a lot of concern really about what was available. We found that there was a lack of choice and availability. So there are actually local authorities in England that don't have a single extra care offer, for example. There are local authorities that have very little to offer on shared lives. So there's huge variation we found between different parts of the country. We found that commissioning was, what, to use the jargon, disjointed. So you have the NHS doing something different from the local authority, something different from housing providers. No one's working together to bring it all together and have a clear plan for the future. We found there's a lack of co-production, in the sense that people weren't really involved in what was being planned locally, what type of design people wanted with their accommodation, how to access that accommodation, what kind of care and support would be available. None of that was really designed with the person at the heart of the decision-making process. So that was a real issue. And then there's a real problem around equalities. We found that certain communities, ethnic minority communities, LGBTQ communities were not having the same access to person-centered options as others. So we've got real problems there. In terms of opportunities, we did come across some very good practice, really exciting, innovative examples, shared lives being one of them, home share, co-living opportunities and options. We found some amazing examples of extra care where you had self-managing care and support teams working hand in glove with the local people living in those places to design the type of care that they wanted. So plenty of good examples, but unfortunately they haven't really been allowed to grow to their potential. So they're still sort of in pockets around the country, which is a problem. I think the opportunity of co-production has been underexploited, really. I think we could really have excellent involvement of local people in how all forms of accommodation are developed in the future, right through the whole process. And it can be a 5-year process to develop new buildings, but right through that process, getting people involved at every stage would really help and improve the quality and innovation that's inherent in these accommodation options. And then I think we've heard a lot from Social Care Future about this, which is how do we make a positive case for change? There's a huge number of people who will want better housing options in the future, and how do we create a positive momentum, a positive voice around the really good stuff that's out there, and how we have more of that really good stuff. So less of talking about care homes in crisis, more about what's really positive and could be really inspiring places for people to live in the future. So if we can kind of keep going with that movement, and we have an opportunity right now with the white paper. White paper is not a done deal, it's not set in stone, it is a set of proposals. And I think this group of people and everyone on the call today could really influence what the government does next on housing with care and support. So keep that going, really. That's enough from me, I think.